Imagine ruling half the planet: Spain, Naples, Sicily, the Americas, Austria, Burgundy. An empire so vast the sun literally never sets on it. That was Charles II's world. On paper, he was the most powerful man alive, but in reality, his servants had to cut up his food like he was a toddler because he couldn't chew. This wasn't due to some accident or rare illness. No, this was by design. What happened to Charles II was the end result of a 300-year genetic experiment, one the royal Habsburg family carried out on themselves. Let's jump to Madrid in the year 1700. Inside the royal Alcazar, a grand dining hall glows with gold plates, silk napkins, and roasted delicacies shipped in from every corner of the empire. And there, at the head of the table, sits Charles II. He's 39 years old, but watching him eat looks more like caring for an elderly man in decline. His mouth hangs open, his jaw juts so far forward that he can't fully close it. Food slips out onto his plate. His tongue is too big for his mouth. He drools. He mumbles. And no one, not even trained diplomats, can understand a word he says. His personal attendant, Don Manuel, stands close, napkin in hand, ready to wipe the king's shin. It's done with the tenderness of a nurse caring for a patient whose lines never get better. Foreign ambassadors left his court in shock. Some thought he resembled a gargoyle more than a monarch. Yet this was the man in charge of the silver mines of Peru, the ports of Naples, and the gold halls of Vienna. So, what went wrong? Just a couple of centuries earlier, the Habsburgs were a name that echoed power, intelligence, and divine authority. They shaped continents, conquered empires, and dictated the future of nations. But by Charles II, their legacy had rotted into something unrecognizable. And the cause, a 300-year love affair with their own DNA. We're about to dive into one of the strangest stories in European history. Not one of war or conquest, but of marriage. Specifically, marriages between cousins. Over and over, 16 generations of inbreeding. The Habsburgs believed their blood was too sacred to mix with outsiders. And each generation, that decision chipped away at the family tree until it was no longer a tree, but a ladder with the same few names repeating endlessly. The results? Kings who couldn't govern their own limbs. Queens who clung to their husbands' rotting corpses. Babies born with bodies too broken to live outside the womb. And court painters like Diego Velázquez documenting their downfall in real time, without even realizing it. By the end of this journey, you'll understand how royal pride became genetic poison, how political brilliance mutated into biological tragedy, and how a dynasty's obsession with purity ended in complete collapse. This is what happens when a royal family tries to keep their blue blood untainted, when they choose legacy over biology and ignore the simplest rule of evolution: diversity equals survival. Their grand experiment ended the moment Charles II took his final breath. He left no children, no heirs, and no future. With him, the Spanish Habsburgs died out, one of the greatest dynasties in history, brought down by its own DNA. Welcome to the Habsburg curse. But like all great horror stories, this one starts like a fairy tale with a brilliant young man and an idea he believed would change the world forever. We rewind to the late 1400s, Austria. Meet Maximilian I, a young king facing enemies on all sides. France to the west, the Ottoman Empire creeping in from the east, and a chaotic mess of German princes in the middle. Traditional kings would have turned to war, built armies, drained treasuries, but Max, he had a different idea. Why spend a fortune on bloodshed when you could just marry your way to power? For Maximilian, wedding rings were better than swords. He saw Europe not as a battlefield, but as a puzzle, a map he could solve by connecting family trees. So, he got to work. He married his son Philip to Joanna of Castile, which gave the Habsburgs a claim to Spain. Then arranged for his grandson, Charles, to wed Isabella of Portugal. Another union, another kingdom. This wasn't just strategy, it was genius, the family's motto. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. And it worked. Each generation of cousin marriages brought new wealth and territory without ever lifting a sword. The empire expanded peacefully, other royal houses followed suit. Soon, Europe's nobility looked more like a family reunion than a collection of rival dynasties. By the 1500s, a suitable royal match usually meant your first cousin. Second cousins were basically outsiders. Why risk polluting the bloodline with outsiders when your own family tree had everything you needed? But here's the thing, that tree stopped branching. It grew upward, straight up. The same families marrying the same families over and over. And nobody questioned it because it worked. The Habsburgs' influence stretched across Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, Italy, and the Americas. Their strategy was paying off in land, gold, and global power. Maximilian died in 1519, believing he'd unlocked the secret to eternal rule. His grandson, Charles V, inherited more territory than any human in history. The genetic experiment was off to a perfect start. But here's what the Habsburgs didn't know. DNA always keeps score. For a moment, it really did seem like Maximilian's strategy had produced a god among men. Imagine being 16 years old and inheriting half the known world and then actually being smart enough to rule it. That was Charles V. This wasn't just some clueless rich kid. Charles was fluent in 6 languages, led successful military campaigns, negotiated decades-long peace treaties, and completely overhauled the legal system of the Holy Roman Empire. Born on February 24, 1500, Charles was the ultimate Habsburg success story. The perfect blend of political acumen, military genius, and royal charisma. His jawline was strong, his mind sharper. Painters like Titian captured him as the ideal Renaissance monarch. And of course, he followed the family playbook to AT in 1526. Charles married his first cousin, Isabella of Portugal. It was a brilliant political move. The union locked in Portuguese trade routes, secured the Iberian Peninsula, and cut off French expansion. Isabella was no passive bride either. She was brilliant, beautiful, and politically aligned with Charles. They had several children. The dynasty looked stronger than ever. European courts looked at Charles and Isabella like the power couple of the century, proof that the Habsburg strategy worked. But if you paid close attention, subtle cracks were already forming. Look at the portraits from this period. Charles's lower jaw, just a little too prominent. Barely noticeable, a quirk. Maybe, court artists called it the family look. Isabella had it too? And their children, it was more pronounced. Still, no red flags, just normal noble features. Or so everyone thought, but behind the scenes, patterns were emerging. Infant mortality was higher than average, more miscarriages. Surviving children had respiratory issues, delayed speech, and struggled with developmental milestones. Nothing that screamed disaster by 16th century standards, but looking back now, the signs were flashing bright red. Charles ruled for 40 years and then did something unheard of. He voluntarily gave up power. In 1556, exhausted by the sheer scope of managing an empire with medieval technology, he retired to a monastery. His empire was so vast he couldn't rule it alone. So, he split it, giving Spain to his son Philip II and Austria to his brother Ferdinand. Then he spent his final years in quiet prayer, convinced he'd built the greatest inheritance any ruler had ever left behind. He died peacefully in 1558, and by every measure of the time, Charles had succeeded. His son Philip inherited the Spanish Empire at its peak, flush with New World silver, dominating trade routes, and boasting military power that seemed unstoppable. The Habsburg genetic experiment looked like a royal master stroke. But the thing about genetics, it works on a longer timeline than politics, and the Habsburgs had been quietly collecting genetic debt for generations. Each cousin marriage added interest. Each birth was another spin of the genetic roulette wheel. Charles V thought he was passing along a crown. In reality, he handed Philip II a ticking time bomb. To see how it all began to fall apart, we need to rewind once more. This time, to Joanna of Castile, Charles V's mother. The first real crack in the Habsburg genetic armor. Joanna had the resume of a perfect queen, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the couple who united Spain and financed Columbus. She was brilliant, multilingual, and poised to inherit one of Europe's most powerful thrones. On paper, she was the ultimate Renaissance woman, but something was off. Her emotions didn't operate like everyone else's. She felt things more deeply, more intensely. Her love could quickly turn into obsession, and when she married Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, the marriage looked like yet another Habsburg win. Two powerful bloodlines merging, except this time, it didn't go to plan. Joanna fell completely, dangerously in love. Philip, not so much. He saw the marriage as a business deal. He had affairs, traveled constantly, and treated her coldly. For most royal women, that was expected, painful. Yes, but part of the job. But Joanna wasn't wired for that kind of cold detachment. She became consumed by jealousy. When Philip was gone, she refused to eat, pacing for hours, flying into rages that scared even her closest servants. When he returned, she clung to him desperately, terrified he would leave again. And once, she famously attacked one of his mistresses with scissors, hacking off the woman's hair in front of the entire court. Doctors of the time called it melancholy. Today, we might call it something else: bipolar disorder, severe anxiety, obsessive-compulsive behavior. But back then, mental illness was either divine punishment or demonic possession. There was no help, no understanding. And then, Philip died suddenly at just 28. That's when Joanna's grief spiraled into something beyond comprehension. She refused to bury him. Instead, she had his body embalmed, placed in an ornate silver coffin, and began a dark journey across Spain, dragging his corpse with her. For months, she traveled only at night, claiming that as a widow, she shouldn't be seen by other men. She guarded his body jealously, ordering it opened so she could kiss his decaying face. She brushed his hair, arranged his clothes, even slept beside the coffin. This wasn't mourning. This was psychosis. Her father, Ferdinand, saw a political opportunity. If Joanna was mad, she couldn't rule. That meant he could rule Castile in her place. So, he began spreading rumors his daughter was possessed, dangerous, unfit. In 1509, he locked her away in a convent. She was just 30. Joanna spent the next 46 years imprisoned. Her son, Charles V, continued her confinement, not because she was a threat, but because it was convenient. A mad mother couldn't challenge his authority. She died in 1555, alone, still officially insane, but modern historians believe she wasn't born that way. She was genetically vulnerable. Her extreme behaviors, her inability to regulate emotions or cope with stress. These may have been symptoms of inherited psychiatric disorders that become more common when close relatives intermarry. Joanna wasn't just a tragic queen, she was the first clear warning sign of a much bigger genetic collapse still to come. By the time her grandson, Philip II, came to power, the genetic damage was no longer subtle. He inherited all the prestige of the Habsburg legacy: Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, the New World, but also inherited the early symptoms of a dynasty on the edge of biological collapse. To the outside world, he was the embodiment of royal control, stoic, pious, reserved. But behind closed doors, Philip was increasingly obsessive, paranoid, and consumed by religious guilt. Philip was the kind of king who micromanaged everything from foreign policy down to the menu of his servants. He built El Escorial, a massive palace monastery, as a symbol of Spanish power and Catholic piety. It was cold, gray, and imposing just like him. He barely smiled, hardly laughed. Obsessed over sin and heresy, he personally signed death warrants for heretics during the Spanish Inquisition. And his family life, that was just as rigid. Philip married 4 times. His first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, was his double first cousin. That's right, double cousin. Their shared grandparents weren't just the same family, they were the same people. The child from that union was Don Carlos, the crown prince. And that's where the genetic house of cards finally began to collapse in public. Don Carlos was born in 1545, and from the beginning, something wasn't right. He had trouble walking, suffered from seizures, and struggled with violent mood swings. He was impulsive, aggressive, and often abusive to those around him. One story tells of him pushing a servant down the stairs just to see what would happen. Another time, he tried to burn a man alive. At 16, he suffered a head injury that made everything worse. After the accident, his behavior spiraled. He began eating compulsively, plotting violent revenge against imagined enemies, and even threatened to kill his father. Philip II, Spanish courtiers were terrified. The heir to the throne, the future of the Habsburg legacy, was completely unstable. Eventually, Philip had no choice. He locked his own son in a tower. Alone, under guard, Don Carlos deteriorated further. He refused food, tore at his clothes, and reportedly went days without speaking. After 6 months in isolation, he died in 1568. He was just 23. His death was officially ruled natural causes, but whispers spread through Europe. Had Philip poisoned his own son? Had the Habsburgs sacrificed a mad prince to save the throne? Whatever the truth, one thing was clear. The royal bloodline wasn't producing kings anymore. It was producing tragedies. And yet, despite all the warning signs, despite all the heartbreak, Philip still believed in the Habsburg formula. After all, it had given him power. So, when it came time for his son to marry, guess what he did? More cousin marriages, more genetic roulette. That son Philip III wasn't the worst, but he wasn't impressive either. He was physically frail, emotionally distant, and politically passive. He ruled by delegation, handing off most decisions to his advisors, one of his greatest contributions. Approving the expulsion of Spain's Moriscos Muslims who had converted to Christianity. The move was a humanitarian disaster, economically damaging, and rooted more in fanaticism than strategy. But again, the dynasty held, the empire limped forward. Then came Philip IV, a charming, handsome king, but with almost no sense of responsibility. He was obsessed with the arts, theater, and sex. He fathered dozens of illegitimate children while barely paying attention to matters of state. Spain's global dominance began to falter. Colonies rebelled, wars drained the treasury, and still no lessons learned. Philip IV married Mary Anna of Austria, his niece. Their daughter was born with such severe deformities that she didn't survive infancy. Their only surviving son, that was Charles II, the final Habsburg king of Spain, and perhaps the most tragic figure in royal history. Charles II was born in 1661, and from the very beginning, he was a medical anomaly. He couldn't speak until he was 4, couldn't walk until he was 8. He suffered from severe epilepsy, chronic infections, and intense developmental delays. His facial deformities were extreme. His jaw was so misaligned he couldn't chew solid food. His tongue was so oversized he could barely speak clearly, and yet, they made him king. Because he was a Habsburg, his reign was a slow-motion disaster. He was mentally unfit to govern, completely controlled by his mother and court advisors. Foreign ambassadors were horrified. One described him as short, lame, epileptic, senile, and completely bald before 35. Another noted, he looked more like a corpse than a king. Doctors tried every medieval remedy, bleeding, purging, exorcisms. Nothing worked. Charles was falling apart, and worse, he couldn't produce an heir. His 2 marriages were childless. His body simply wasn't capable. The Habsburg line in Spain had finally reached a genetic dead end. In 1700, Charles II died at the age of 38. His body was so deteriorated that when doctors performed an autopsy, they were shocked. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were filled with fluid. His intestines were gangrenous. He had just 1 atrophied testicle, and his head was full of water. The Habsburgs had spent centuries trying to perfect royal blood. But in the end, they had created a man who was broken from birth. Charles II was the final warning. the final cry of a gene pool that had been closed for too long, and with his death, the Spanish Empire collapsed into chaos. But the Habsburg story doesn't end there. Because while Spain's real line died with Charles, the Austrian branch survived. And they would take the genetic experiment even further. While Spain's Habsburg line came to a dramatic and grotesque end with Charles II, the Austrian Habsburgs based in Vienna kept the dynasty alive, and in many ways, they doubled down. The Austrian Habsburgs were just as committed to family purity, and their obsession with intermarriage continued. Cousins, nieces, and nephews generation after generation were paired off like chess pieces on a royal board. Every union was about territory, not biology, and while their Spanish cousins crumbled from physical deformity, the Austrian Habsburgs suffered from different consequences: infertility, mental illness, and dynastic instability. One of the most iconic Habsburgs from this branch was Maria Theresa, who ruled in the 18th century. She was strong-willed, clever, and determined to modernize the empire, but she was also the product of intense inbreeding. Her father, Emperor Charles VI, had married Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, a relative, and Maria Theresa continued the cycle by marrying her cousin, Francis Stephen of Lorraine. Still, she managed to have 16 children, and among them was a daughter who would change history forever, Marie Antoinette. Yes, the ill-fated Queen of France, the symbol of aristocratic excess and eventual revolution, was a Habsburg. And her story, like so many in the family, would end in tragedy. Marie Antoinette was born into a world where royal marriages were still treated like treaties. At 14, she was sent off to marry the future Louis XVI of France. The goal, to strengthen the alliance between the Austrian Habsburgs and the French Bourbons. But the plan backfired spectacularly. French nobles despised her Austrian roots. She was mocked, scrutinized, and blamed for everything from failed harvests to national debt. Her spending didn't help, nor did her complete disconnect from the suffering of her people. While France starved, she built extravagant gardens and played pretend in a fake village built just for her. And when revolution came, the mob made her a symbol of everything wrong with monarchy. She died on the guillotine in 1793. The crowd cheered. Another Habsburg cut down by the consequences of a system to out of touch, to inbred, to detached from reality. But even after the French Revolution, the Habsburgs still weren't done. As Europe convulsed with war and rebellion, the family adapted not by changing their bloodlines, but by tightening their grip on power. The Austrian Empire became the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and at the center of it was Franz Joseph I, a man who ruled for nearly 70 years. Franz Joseph married his cousin, Elizabeth of Bavaria, better known as Sisi. Their marriage was unhappy, their children suffered, and their reign was marked by constant instability. Sisi hated the rigid formality of the court. She became reclusive, obsessed with her appearance, and haunted by tragedy. Her son, Crown Prince Rudolph, committed suicide in a murder-suicide pact at a hunting lodge, ending any hope of a direct heir. And the empire kept limping along. But the real turning point, the moment that would shatter the Habsburgs forever, came with Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was the nephew of Emperor Franz Joseph and heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Unlike his predecessors, Franz Ferdinand wanted reform. He believed in granting more autonomy to the empire's many ethnic groups: Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, Serbs, but his ideas made him enemies within the royal court and throughout Europe. And then, in 1914, during a visit to Sarajevo, Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie, were assassinated by a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. That single gunshot didn't just kill a man, it triggered World War I. The alliances snapped into place. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Russia mobilized, Germany followed. France and Britain were pulled in, millions would die. And for the Habsburgs, it was the final blow. The war devastated the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Ethnic tensions exploded, the economy collapsed, and by 1918, the empire was dissolved. Franz Joseph had died during the war, and his grandnephew, Karl I, became the last Habsburg emperor. Karl tried to hold things together, but it was too late. The world had moved on. Monarchies were collapsing everywhere. The idea of divine bloodlines, of royal families ruling by virtue of their name alone, that idea was dying. In 1919, Karl was forced into exile. The Habsburgs were stripped of their power, their lands, and their titles. After nearly 700 years of dominance, the most powerful family in Europe was finished. But the legacy of their bloodline, that lived on, because scientists, historians, and geneticists have spent decades unraveling the story of the Habsburgs, trying to understand how a family could rise so high and fall so catastrophically. The answer: inbreeding. Over 600 years, the Habsburgs married almost exclusively within their own family. In fact, studies show that their inbreeding coefficient, a measure of how genetically similar your parents are, is higher than what you'd expect from a brother-sister union. The consequences were inevitable: deformities, infertility, mental illness, and, eventually, extinction. They thought they were preserving royal blood. What they were really doing was poisoning it. And perhaps, more than any battle or revolution, that was the downfall of the Habsburgs. But their story doesn't just belong in history books. It's a warning, a case study in what happens when power is prioritized over people, when tradition overrides common sense, when a family becomes so obsessed with control, they forget what it means to be human. The Habsburgs weren't just victims of bad genetics, they were victims of their own choices. In the years after the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the once mighty Habsburgs faded into the background of a world that no longer had room for divine rulers. Their castles became museums, their estates were nationalized, and their titles worthless, but the family didn't vanish entirely. Some Habsburg descendants still walk among us today. They live modest lives, at least compared to their royal ancestors. Some work regular jobs, others dabble in politics or charity. And though the royal blood is still technically in their veins, the myth of their supremacy is long gone. And maybe that's for the best, because if the Habsburg story teaches us anything, it's that power without perspective is dangerous, that empires built on ego and isolation are doomed to collapse, and that even the most powerful families in history can be undone, not by war or rebellion, but by their own blind ambition. The Habsburgs weren't just a royal dynasty. They were a living, breathing experiment, one that showed us, in excruciating detail, the cost of inbreeding, the danger of echo chambers, and the absurdity of believing that blood alone makes someone fit to rule. And let's be clear, this isn't just about bad genes or physical deformities. It's about what happens when you design an entire system around maintaining control instead of earning it, when you prioritize purity over health, when you pass down not just power, but problems generation after generation because you're too proud to admit the system is broken. The Habsburgs ruled Europe for centuries, but by the end, they were prisoners of their own legacy, trapped in golden cages, bound by duty, haunted by ghosts of the past, and all the while, their subjects, farmers, soldiers, merchants, peasants paid the price for a dynasty that valued its name more than its people. Even today, the remnants of that legacy linger. Tourists still flock to Vienna to see the palaces and jewels. Historians still pore over family trees and royal letters, and geneticists still study the Habsburg jaw like it's a puzzle from a bygone age. But beneath the marble halls and oil paintings lies a darker truth, a cautionary tale about the limits of legacy. The idea that greatness can be inherited like furniture, that empires can be preserved in a bottle, untouched by the world around them. The truth is, nothing, no matter how royal, is immune to decay. Not palaces, not power, not people, and maybe that's the most human part of this entire story. Because while the Habsburgs tried to defy nature, they ended up proving its laws. They thought they could outsmart evolution, but biology had the final say. And in the end, Their greatest strength, their unbroken lineage, became their greatest curse. So, what do we take from all this? What's the lesson buried beneath 700 years of crowns, marriages, and mistakes? It's this: you can't build a future by clinging to the past. Not in politics, not in families, not in life. Progress demands change. Health requires adaptation. And legacy means nothing if it isn't earned, challenged, and evolved. The Habsburgs believed they were chosen by God, but in the end, they were brought down by the very thing they tried hardest to preserve, their bloodline. So, the next time you look at an old painting of a king with a drooping lip and a jutting jaw, remember, that isn't just a face. It's a warning, a symbol of what happens when power goes unchecked. When tradition becomes dogma, when a name becomes more important than the people who carry it. Because even the greatest empires fall, even the most powerful families fade. And in the ruins, all that's left is a story. A story we tell ourselves not to celebrate their glory, but to understand their downfall. Let's share, connect, and explore the stories that have shaped our world. If this video helped you see history in a new light, with more depth, understanding, or simply spark new questions, don't forget to subscribe to Legacy of Ages. History is never just the past, it's always part of our present.